John's first step into the forest was met with a sudden and almost suffocating shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the entire world beyond the treeling had ceased to exist, replaced by an unnatural, otherworldly silence that made his ears ring. The air was thick, not just with the usual dampness of an old forest, but with something heavier, almost alive, a sense of foreboding that seemed to weigh on his shoulders, urging him to turn back. The path ahead was choked with vines and thick underbrush, the trees standing like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting together to block out the sky. Every step he took was tentative, each crackle of dried leaves underfoot like a shout in the heavy silence. The deeper John ventured, the more the forest seemed to swallow him. The light from the setting sun barely penetrated the dense canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to writhe across the forest floor. Shapes flickered in the corners of his eyes, vanishing whenever he tried to look directly at them, dark silhouettes that made his skin crawl. It felt as though the trees themselves were shifting, adjusting, closing in around him. There were no birds singing, no distant rustle of animals. It was as if every living thing had fled, leaving him utterly alone. Yet there was a presence, something unseen but unmistakable, watching him from the shadows. A sudden chill ran down John's spine as he caught sight of something strange ahead. There, in the gloom, an old, crumbling structure loomed, a watchtower, half devoured by creeping vines and decay. It wasn't marked on any of the maps he had studied, and he felt a pang of unease as he approached it. The tower exuded an air of abandonment, its stone walls covered in moss, windows shattered like hollow eyes staring into nothing. A cold draft seeped from within, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a sound that might have been the wind, but felt too deliberate, too chilling. The air grew colder as he approached the entrance, an archway that yawned open like a mouth waiting to devour him. His flashlight flickered as he shone it inside, the weak beam barely piercing the shadows. He could see the outline of old, splintered stairs winding up, disappearing into darkness. A noise, a low, almost imperceptible groan, emanated from deep within the tower, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air, resonating in his bones. John hesitated. It was a sound that carried with it an unspoken warning, an urge that every instinct screamed at him to obey. Leave now, while you still can. But curiosity, that insidious pull, kept his feet rooted to the spot. He stepped closer, and that was when he saw them, marks etched into the stone beside the door. They were deep gouges, uneven and frantic, as if someone had clawed at the rock in desperation. The scratches led away from the door, down to the earth, where the dirt was disturbed, darkened in patches that looked almost like bloodstains. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the growing sense of dread pooling in his stomach. He felt his mouth go dry as he backed away from the entrance, every instinct now screaming at him to run. And then it happened. A rustling, sudden and violent, high up in the treetops above him. John looked up, flashlight beam darting through the dense branches. For a moment, he saw nothing, just the chaotic weave of limbs and leaves. But then, two pinpoints of light appeared, reflecting back at him, eyes, large and glinting, peering down at him from above. They blinked, and he felt his entire body seize with fear. Whatever it was massive, and it was moving, the branches swaying and groaning under its weight. The creature remained just out of sight, but John could feel its gaze, sharp and intelligent, tracking his every move. Suddenly, a low growl, almost like the rumble of distant thunder, resonated from above, a sound so deep it made the ground beneath him seem to tremble. John's legs moved before his mind could catch up, the primal instinct to flee taking over. He turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, the oppressive silence of the forest replaced by the crashing sound of his own panicked flight. The branches seemed to claw at him, the air thick with the sense of something massive and malevolent pursuing him. He didn't dare look back. Whatever lurked in those treetops, it was awake now, and it was coming for him. John stumbled deeper into the forest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he tried to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever had been lurking above. But no matter how far he ran, the oppressive feeling of the forest seemed to grow stronger, as though the trees themselves were shifting to trap him, their twisted limbs closing in. The light was fading fast, and soon his flashlight was the only thing cutting through the thick, enveloping darkness. Each step seemed heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on him, trying to drive him into the earth. Eventually, John found himself in a small clearing, a strange, almost perfectly circular patch of ground where the trees seemed to lean away, their branches arcing outwards as though repelled by some unseen force. The clearing felt familiar, and a cold chill ran down his spine as he looked around, his flashlight sweeping across the shadows. Then he saw it, a peculiar, jagged stone formation jutting out from the center of the clearing, covered in moss and etched with strange, faded carvings. A wave of déjà vu hit him, a sense that he had been here before, even though he was certain he had never ventured this deep into the forest. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, fragmented, like a dream half remembered. He could see himself as a child, walking hand in hand with his grandfather. The old man had led him to this very clearing, though back then it hadn't felt so sinister. He remembered his grandfather's face, kind but serious, his voice low as he sang an old rhyme, a lullaby of sorts, though it had never comforted him the way it should have. The words had always seemed strange, almost like a warning, and now, in this setting, they took on an even darker meaning. John could barely recall the lyrics, just snatches of phrases that seemed to echo in his mind. Creatures in the trees, shadows that guard, never take what isn't yours. As the memory faded, John's eyes were drawn back to the stone formation. He noticed something he hadn't before, an object lodged between two of the stones, partially hidden beneath the moss. Slowly, hesitantly, he approached and knelt down, pulling away the damp vegetation. His fingers brushed against something smooth and cold, a small wooden figure, carved in the shape of a man, with arms outstretched as if in warning or supplication. The carving was old, the details worn, but something about it sent a jolt of fear through him. He remembered it now. This was his. He had seen it before, had held it in his hands as a child. His grandfather had given it to him that day, and he had lost it here, in this very clearing. John's heart began to pound, a creeping sense of dread tightening in his chest. Why was it still here? How had it survived all these years untouched, as if waiting for him to return? He could feel the air grow colder around him, the shadows at the edge of the clearing seeming to thicken, to move closer. The memory of his grandfather's voice echoed in his mind once more, and this time he could hear the fear in it, the urgency. He had never understood why his grandfather had brought him here, why he had insisted they leave so suddenly, his face pale and eyes wide with something John hadn't recognized back then, terror. A sound broke the silence, a faint whisper, almost inaudible, coming from behind him. John turned, his flashlight flickering as it swept across the clearing. Nothing. Just the dark, dense wall of trees, the branches shifting slightly in the wind. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, low and melodic, singing the same rhyme his grandfather used to sing. The words seemed to drift through the air, carried on an invisible breeze, wrapping around him, chilling him to the bone. He felt a presence, something watching him, not just from the trees, but from within the very ground beneath his feet, from the stones that had stood in this clearing for centuries. John's eyes widened as he looked back at the wooden figure, and he realized something he hadn't noticed before. The carved face, it was his own. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and a wave of nausea rolled over him. He stumbled backward, dropping the figure as if it had burned him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, taking shape, rising up from the ground like smoke. Panic surged through him, and he turned to run, his flashlight casting wild beams of light that did little to pierce the growing darkness. As he fled the clearing, John could feel the forest closing in on him once more, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to pull him back. The memory of his grandfather's fearful eyes haunted him, and he knew deep down that whatever secrets lay buried in this forest were tied to him, connected to a past he had forgotten, or perhaps had chosen to forget. And as the whispers followed him, growing louder, more demanding, John realized that the forest wanted something from him, something it had been waiting for all these years. The past wasn't just forgotten. It was alive, and it was calling him back, refusing to let him go. John's heart pounded as he stumbled through the dense underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers from the clearing still echoed in his ears, growing more insistent with every passing moment, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, demanding his attention. He could feel the forest tightening around him, the shadows growing deeper, as if entire woods were conspiring to trap him. Panic surged in his veins, and he pushed forward, branches clawing at his clothes, the path twisting in impossible ways, as if the forest itself was alive, shifting to confuse and disorient him. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way, and he found himself tumbling down a steep embankment, his body rolling uncontrollably until he crashed to a stop at the bottom. He lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented, staring up at the dark canopy above. The world seemed to spin, and the whispers were louder now, so close they seemed to be coming from inside his own mind. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the fall. His flashlight had rolled away, its beam flickering weakly, illuminating a large, ancient tree standing in front of him. There, at the base of the tree, was something that made his blood run cold. A doorway, carved into the trunk, its edges covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. It was as if the forest itself had opened up, offering him a way forward, though every instinct screamed at him to turn and run. But there was nowhere else to go. The forest had closed in behind him, the path gone, replaced by a solid wall of impenetrable darkness. The only way was forward, through the doorway that seemed to pulse with a strange, malevolent energy. John took a hesitant step toward the door, and as he did, a sudden wave of cold washed over him. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and he realized they were speaking to him, pleading, warning, demanding. He could almost make out the words, could almost understand what they wanted, but it was like listening to a language just beyond his comprehension. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the edge of the doorway. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, and the moment his fingers made contact, a sharp pain shot through his head, a vision flashing before his eyes. He saw his grandfather, standing in this very spot, his face twisted in fear and sorrow. The old man was holding something, a small, glowing object that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. John watched helpless as his grandfather knelt before the doorway, placing the object at its base. The whispers grew louder, and his grandfather looked up, his eyes meeting John's. There was a look of resignation there, a silent plea for forgiveness. And then the vision was gone, leaving John gasping, his head pounding, the cold seeping into his bones. The whispers changed then, their tone shifting, and John understood what they wanted. They demanded a sacrifice, a piece of himself, something precious, something irreplaceable. He had to make a choice. He could leave the forest, but only if he gave up the memory of his grandfather, the man who had raised him, who had been his only family. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him, the forest waiting, watching, the air thick with anticipation. The doorway seemed to pulse, the symbols glowing brighter, and John knew he didn't have much time. Tears filled his eyes as he thought of his grandfather, of the man who had taught him to fish, who had read him stories by the fire, who had always been there, a steady presence in his life. The thought of losing those memories, of forgetting the warmth of his grandfather's smile, the sound of his laughter, it was almost too much to bear. But the forest was relentless, the whispers growing louder, more demanding, and John knew there was no other way. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to escape this nightmare, he had to give them what they wanted. With a trembling hand, John reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden figure he had found in the clearing. It was a simple carving, worn and faded, but it was all he had left of his grandfather, the last tangible connection to the man who had meant so much to him. He knelt before the doorway, just as he had seen his grandfather do, and placed the figure at its base. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, the air around him vibrating with an unnatural energy, and for a moment, John thought he might be torn apart by the force of it. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The cold lifted, the oppressive weight of the forest easing, and the doorway began to close, the symbols fading until they were nothing more than faint etchings in the bark. John felt a deep emptiness inside him, a hollow ache where the memories of his grandfather had once been. He tried to picture his face, to remember his voice, but it was like trying to grasp smoke, every detail slipping away, lost to the darkness. He was left with only the vague sense of loss, a sorrow that had no shape, no name. The forest seemed to release its hold on him, the path ahead clearing, the way forward open once more. John stood, his legs weak, his heart heavy, and began to walk. He didn't look back, couldn't bear to see the place where he had left a piece of himself behind. The forest was silent now, the whispers gone, but he could still feel their presence, a lingering echo in the back of his mind. He knew he had made the right choice. There had been no other way. But as he walked, the emptiness inside him grew, a void that no amount of distance could fill. The forest had taken its price, and John knew that he would never be whole again. As John walked deeper into the forest, the air grew thicker, more oppressive, as if the woods were tightening their grip on him with every step. The silence that had once engulfed the forest was now broken by faint, almost imperceptible whispers. They were elusive, never seeming to come from one place, but rather from all around him, moving through the branches, slipping through the dense foliage, echoing off the trees. It was as though the very shadows had come alive, carrying voices from a world he could neither see nor understand. Each whisper was low, barely a breath, but the effect was chilling, a cold shiver running down his spine. John strained to listen, trying to make sense of the voices, but the words were jumbled, alien, and maddeningly out of reach. He turned in circles, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing nothing that could explain the sound. Every shadow seemed to shift just out of sight, morphing into figures that vanished as soon as he turned his head. He felt his grip on reality slipping, as if the forest was bending his perception, warping what he saw and heard until he could no longer trust his own senses. The whispers seemed to know him, to call his name, drawing him toward the unseen depths of the forest. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, a tremor that vibrated through the earth, throwing him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself against a tree, his hand landing on the rough bark that felt almost warm, pulsing beneath his palm like a heartbeat. He jerked his hand back, his skin tingling, and looked around in growing panic. The forest had changed. The path he had been following was gone, replaced by a thick wall of trees, their branches twisted together as if to bar his way. He was trapped, the clearing he had left now sealed off, and the whispers had grown louder, more insistent, almost angry. John could feel the presence in the forest now, not just in the shadows, but in the trees themselves, in the very air he breathed. It was as if the entire forest was alive, aware of him, watching him, waiting. He could see movement out of the corner of his eye, dark shapes slipping between the trees, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Each time he turned to look, there was nothing there, only the thick, impenetrable shadows. The whispers swirled around him, growing louder until they were almost deafening, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from within the forest and within his own mind. And then, the whispers changed. They became words, clear, unmistakable. Leave. Leave now. The voice was deep, resonant, echoing in the darkness, and John's heart pounded as he looked around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. But there was no one there. The forest was empty, yet he could feel eyes on him, dozens of them, hidden in the shadows. The voice came again, closer now, the words almost a growl, filled with a malice that made his blood run cold. "Leave, or become one of us." John's breath caught in his throat, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin. He had to get out, had to find a way out of this nightmare before it was too late. Suddenly, the forest erupted with sound, a cacophony of cracking branches, rustling leaves, and that deep, guttural growl he had heard before. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, the shadows breaking away from the trees, rushing toward him. John spun around, his flashlight catching a glimpse of something huge, something that moved through the darkness with a speed and grace that defied reason. He saw eyes, large, glowing eyes that blinked at him from the treetops, from the ground, from the very shadows themselves. The forest was full of them, surrounding him, closing in. Panic surged through John, and he turned to run, his legs feeling like lead, each step an effort, as if the forest was trying to hold him back. The whispers followed him, the voices now angry, almost screaming, and he could feel the presence closing in on him, the cold breath of something ancient and malevolent at the back of his neck. The path ahead was twisted, shifting, the trees moving, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at his clothes, his skin. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell, crashing to the ground, his flashlight rolling away, plunging him into near darkness. John lay there, gasping, his body trembling, as the whispers surrounded him. He could see the shadows moving, coming closer, and he knew he couldn't stay there. He crawled forward, his hands scraping against the rough ground, feeling the cold seep into his bones. He grabbed the flashlight, its weak beam flickering, barely piercing the darkness, but it was enough to see a narrow opening between the trees, a way out. He forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking, and stumbled toward it, the whispers growing louder, more desperate, as if the forest itself was pleading with him to stay. He broke through the trees, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting as he stumbled into another clearing. The air was still, the whispers suddenly gone, and John collapsed to his knees, his body exhausted, his mind reeling. He looked back, and the forest stood there, dark and silent, the shadows no longer moving, the eyes gone. But he could still feel it, that presence, watching him from the darkness, waiting. The forest had let him go, but John knew it wasn't over. The whispers had said to leave, but they had also made a promise, a threat. The forest wanted something from him, and it wouldn't rest until it got what it wanted. John stumbled through the clearing, his breath shallow and rapid, the adrenaline masking the aches and bruises from his fall. The silence that followed the cacophony in the forest was almost worse, unnatural, as though the world itself had been muted. But the whispers hadn't left him. They had moved inside his head, burrowing into his thoughts, intertwining with his fears and memories. The further he walked, the more the whispers seemed to warp his perception, the once familiar sounds and sights of the forest shifting into something otherworldly, filled with malice and hidden threats. As he continued on, the forest seemed to darken, the shadows stretching out, creeping toward him as if they had a mind of their own. John could feel his heartbeat in his ears, the rhythm erratic as his fear began to swell, pushing rational thought aside. He knew that the forest was toying with him, that the entity or presence lurking there fed off his terror, but that knowledge did little to stave off the rising panic. He stumbled over roots that seemed to rise deliberately in his path, and each time he glanced behind, he saw the shadows shifting, creeping closer, a darkness that seemed eager to swallow him whole. Suddenly, the forest around him began to twist. Trees that had stood tall and straight now appeared bent and warped, their branches curling like skeletal claws, reaching out to ensnare him. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and John realized that they were no longer just random, incoherent sounds. They had taken on the form of voices he recognized, his grandfather's stern admonitions, his mother's loving reassurances, even his own voice, filled with fear and doubt. Each whisper seemed designed to exploit his deepest insecurities, to draw out the fears he had buried for years. He saw things then, in the periphery of his vision, visions that came and went like fleeting mirages. The image of his childhood home stood in the clearing for a moment, engulfed in flames, the windows shattered, black smoke curling into the sky. He could see himself standing outside, a young boy, powerless to do anything but watch as the place he'd call home was consumed by fire. He blinked, and the vision was gone, replaced by another, his mother, turning away from him, her expression cold and filled with disappointment. She faded, and then John saw himself, standing alone in the forest, his face twisted in terror, his hands stained red with something dark and viscous. Fear gnawed at his mind, each vision worse than the last, leaving him feeling disoriented, his sense of time and space unraveling. He knew that these were illusions, that the forest was using his fears against him, but the terror was all too real. His chest tightened, and he struggled to breathe, the world around him blurring as his anxiety peaked. It felt as though the forest was alive, pressing in on him, the trees whispering secrets of his darkest moments, drawing out memories he had long since tried to forget. He had never felt so alone, so utterly powerless. And then he saw something ahead, a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of his flickering flashlight. John's breath caught, and he squinted, trying to make out the figure's face. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his features obscured by the darkness, but there was something familiar about him. As John took a step closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, and in its place stood another vision, a younger version of himself, staring back at him with wide, frightened eyes. The whispers twisted in his mind, urging him to approach, promising that all his fears would vanish if he simply embraced them. John hesitated, his entire body trembling. He knew that if he reached out, if he allowed himself to fall into the temptation of his fear, the forest would consume him. The visions, the whispers, they were all designed to break him, to strip him of his sanity until he was nothing more than another lost soul, wandering the woods forever. But even knowing this, the urge was almost irresistible. It would be so easy to give in, to let go of the terror that gripped him, to surrender to the shadows and let them take him. The fear had become a weight, dragging him down, and he was so tired. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged, the darkness pressing in around him. He could feel the temptation pulling at him, the promise of an end to the fear, the whispers now almost gentle, coaxing him, urging him to give in. But somewhere, deep inside, a memory surfaced, faint, almost lost in the chaos of his thoughts. It was his grandfather's voice, not the warped, mocking version the forest had shown him, but the real one, filled with warmth and strength. Never let the darkness take hold, John. There's always a way out. You just have to find it. John opened his eyes, his vision clearing as he forced himself to take a step back. The whispers grew angry, the shadows around him shifting, swirling in agitation. He gritted his teeth, the fear still there, but no longer controlling him. He had come this far. He couldn't give up now. He turned away from the visions, from the shadows that promised an easy escape, and forced himself to move forward. Each step was a struggle, the fear clinging to him, but he pushed on, refusing to give in to the temptation that lurked in every corner of his mind. The forest seemed to react, the shadows receding slightly, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for him to catch his breath. The path ahead was still dark, still filled with unknown threats, but John knew now that he couldn't let the fear dictate his actions. He had to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the darkness rather than succumb to it. The whispers continued, angry and insistent, but he blocked them out, focusing only on the ground in front of him, on putting one foot in front of the other. The forest was far from done with him, but for now he had taken back control, if only for a little while. The path through the forest seemed endless, twisting and turning, each step taking John deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder still, and the oppressive silence returned, a quiet so deep it seemed to muffle even the sound of his own footsteps. John could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, a constant reminder that he was not alone. He moved cautiously, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness, his breath visible in the cold air. The whispers had quieted, replaced by an eerie stillness that was even more unnerving. It was as if the forest was waiting, watching his every move, anticipating his next mistake. Then in the distance, John saw something, a faint glow, barely visible through the trees. His heart skipped a beat as he approached, the light growing brighter, taking on an unnatural, bluish hue. The glow seemed to pulse, a rhythmic flicker that matched the pounding of his own heart. He pushed forward, the cold biting into his skin, and soon found himself standing at the edge of a small clearing. In the center, a large stone altar stood, covered in moss and strange symbols that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. The glow was emanating from the altar, casting long shadows across the clearing that seemed to move and shift of their own accord. John's eyes were drawn to the object on the altar, a small, glowing orb, pulsating with a strange, almost hypnotic light. It was the same object he had seen in the vision of his grandfather, the one he had placed at the base of the tree. A chill ran through him as he approached, a sense of déjà vu washing over him, as if he had done this before. The whispers returned, faint and distant, urging him forward, filling his mind with fragments of memories, images of his grandfather, of his childhood, of the forest that seemed both familiar and alien at once. As John stepped closer, the shadows around the clearing began to move, taking on form and substance, dark figures rising from the ground. They were human-shaped, yet distorted, their faces featureless, their limbs elongated, moving with an unnatural fluidity that sent a shiver down his spine. They surrounded the clearing, their presence a silent, looming threat, their eyeless faces turned toward him. John's heart pounded as he realized they were blocking his way out, closing in, leaving him with only one option: to confront whatever force lay within the glowing orb. With trembling hands, he reached out, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the orb. The moment he made contact, a shock ran through his body, and the world around him seemed to shift. He was no longer in the clearing, but somewhere else. An endless, dark void, the ground beneath him barely solid, as if he stood on the edge of reality itself. In front of him, the shadows began to gather, swirling and coalescing into a shape, a figure, tall and imposing, its presence overwhelming. It had no face, yet John could feel its eyes on him, could feel its power, a malevolence that seemed to seep into his very soul. The entity spoke, though its voice was not a sound but a feeling, a deep vibration that resonated within him, filling his mind with thoughts that were not his own. It showed him images, his grandfather standing before the altar, placing the orb there as a sacrifice, the shadows surrounding him, accepting the offering. John understood then. The forest had taken something from his grandfather, a piece of him, and now it wanted the same from John. It wanted more than just memories. It wanted his essence, his very being, to become one with the forest, to join the countless others who had fallen before him. Fear gripped John's heart, but with it came a spark of defiance. He had come too far, endured too much to simply give in. He had seen what the forest had done to his grandfather, had felt the emptiness where those cherished memories once were, and he refused to let the same fate befall him. The entity loomed closer, its presence growing more oppressive, and John knew he had to act. He focused on the memory of his grandfather, the warmth of his smile, the strength of his hands. He summoned that memory, holding on to it with every ounce of his will, refusing to let the forest take it from him. The orb in his hand grew warmer, the light intensifying, and for a moment, John felt a connection, a link between himself and the entity, a bridge that allowed him to see into its mind. He saw flashes of the past, the forest as it once was, alive, thriving, before the darkness had taken hold. He saw the first sacrifice, a desperate attempt to appease a force that could not be reasoned with, a pact that had bound the souls of the lost to the forest for all eternity. And he saw a way out, a chance to break the cycle, to free himself from the grip of the darkness. John tightened his grip on the orb, the warmth now burning, almost unbearable, and he focused all his fear, all his pain into a single thought: release. The light from the orb exploded, a blinding flash that illuminated the clearing, the shadows recoiling, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The entity let out a soundless scream, a wave of fury and anguish that seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. John felt the connection snap, the weight lifting, the darkness receding as the clearing returned to view. He was back, the altar before him, the orb now dark and cold in his hand. The shadows were gone, the clearing empty, the forest silent. John fell to his knees, the exhaustion overwhelming, but a sense of relief washing over him. He had faced the darkness, had confronted the entity that had haunted his family, and he had won, if only for now. The forest had not claimed him, had not taken his soul, but he knew it was not over. The darkness still lingered, a presence that would never fully fade, a reminder of the price that had been paid. As he stood, the orb crumbled in his hand, the ashes scattering in the wind, and John knew that he could never return. The forest had shown him its true face, had revealed the depth of its hunger, and he had escaped. But the whispers would remain, always at the edge of his mind, a reminder that the darkness was still there, waiting, watching, biding its time. And as he made his way out of the clearing, the path opening before him, John could feel the forest's gaze, a silent promise that it would never forget. John moved through the forest, the remnants of the orb's ashes slipping through his fingers, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. He could feel a shift in the air, a charged tension that clung to every leaf and branch. The forest had become even more sinister, the silence broken by a deep, rhythmic thrumming, like a heartbeat echoing through the very ground beneath his feet. He knew that whatever respite he had found was temporary, that the forest's true force, the entity that had haunted him, was not finished. The orb's destruction had angered it, and now it was preparing for the final confrontation. Suddenly, the trees ahead began to part, revealing an opening, a vast, hollow space where the ground dipped into a shallow basin. The area was lit by an eerie, ghostly light that had no discernible source, casting elongated shadows that twisted and shifted across the forest floor. In the center of the basin stood the entity, a tall, indistinct figure of darkness, its form rippling like smoke, its eyes two pits of glowing, molten amber. It was waiting for him, its presence oppressive, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. John's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling as he stepped forward, knowing there was no other choice. The shadows that surrounded the entity began to writhe, stretching out like tendrils, reaching for him, weaving through the ground like dark serpents. The whispers returned, louder now, their words incomprehensible, filled with rage and malice. John could feel the weight of the entity's gaze on him, a force pressing down on his very soul, trying to break his will, to bend him to its will. The memories that the forest had stolen flashed through his mind, his grandfather's face, now a blur, his voice a distant echo. The forest had taken so much, had taken from him pieces of his very being, and now it wanted more. John took a step forward, his flashlight flickering weakly, its light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The entity moved, its form expanding, the shadows around it growing, reaching out to envelop him. He could feel the coldness of them, a biting, unnatural chill that sank into his bones, numbing his thoughts, dulling his senses. The fear that he had been holding back surged to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him, to paralyze him. But he couldn't let it. He had come too far, endured too much to be consumed now. He forced himself to remember what was at stake, his freedom, his very soul. The entity let out a sound, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the air, vibrating through the ground, rattling the very core of his being. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around John's legs, pulling him toward the basin, the cold seeping deeper into his flesh. He struggled against them, his heart pounding, his body screaming for him to flee. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, filling his mind with thoughts that were not his own, urging him to give in, to surrender, to let go of the fight. But John wouldn't surrender. He clenched his teeth, his hand reaching into his pocket, fingers closing around the last thing he had, a small shard of the orb, cold and sharp, its edges digging into his skin. He held it up, the shard catching the ghostly light, reflecting it back into the dark. The entity recoiled, the shadows pulling back slightly, as if burned by the glow. It was a small victory, but was enough. John pushed forward, his legs heavy, the shadows resisting, fighting to pull him back, but he forced himself to take another step, and another. The shard in his hand began to glow, its light growing brighter, the whispers faltering, their fury turning to desperation. The entity let out a roar, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the basin, a wave of force that knocked John to the ground. The shadows surged forward again, enveloping him, pulling him into the darkness. But John held the shard tight, its glow now almost blinding. He could feel the cold receding, the warmth of the light spreading through his body, pushing back against the shadows, against the entity that sought to consume him. With a shout, John thrust the shard forward, aiming directly at the heart of the entity. The shadows recoiled, the tendrils snapping back, and the light from the shard exploded, filling the basin with a blinding brilliance. The entity let out a final, anguished scream, its form disintegrating, the darkness unraveling, the whispers fading into nothingness. The shadows that had surrounded him vanished, the cold lifting, replaced by an overwhelming stillness. John collapsed to his knees, the shard crumbling to dust in his hand, the light fading, leaving him alone in the basin. The forest was silent. The oppressive weight, the malevolent presence, was gone. John could feel it. The entity had been defeated, the darkness that had haunted him now nothing more than a memory. He looked up, the ghostly light that had filled the basin now gone, replaced by the dim, natural glow of the moon filtering through the branches. The trees stood still, no longer twisted, no longer reaching for him. The forest had returned to what it once was, a dark, ancient place, but no longer haunted by the presence of something evil. John struggled to his feet, his body aching, every muscle screaming in protest. He had faced the darkness, had confronted the entity that had taken so much from him, and he had survived. He knew that he would carry the scars of this night forever, that the memories of what he had seen, what he had endured, would never fully fade. But he also knew that he was free, that the forest no longer held him, that he could leave, that he could finally go home. He took a deep breath, the air crisp and cold, and turned away from the basin, the path ahead now clear. As he walked, the forest remained silent, the oppressive weight that had followed him for so long now gone. The whispers had faded, the shadows no longer moved, and for the first time since he had entered the woods, John felt a sense of peace. The darkness had tried to consume him, had tried to take everything he held dear, but he had fought back, and he had won. The forest had taken its price, but it had not taken him. And as he walked away, the memory of the entity's final scream still echoing faintly in his mind, John knew that he would never return. The forest had been defeated, but its darkness would always remain, a silent, lingering presence, a reminder of what he had faced and what he had overcome. John emerged from the forest, the first rays of dawn piercing the darkness, the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the trees. He felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, his body heavy, his limbs aching, each step requiring all his strength. The weight of what he had experienced clung to him like a shroud, the memories vivid and inescapable. The forest behind him was silent now, no longer filled with whispers or the shifting shadows that had tormented him, yet its presence lingered, a haunting reminder of what lay within its depths. As he finally reached the edge of the woods, John dared to look back, his eyes scanning the treeline for any sign of movement. The trees stood still, bathed in the early morning light, appearing almost serene. But John knew better. He knew that the calm was a facade, that beneath the surface, the darkness still lurked, waiting for another soul to wander too far, to be tempted by the secrets hidden within. The entity was gone, its presence defeated, but the forest was still alive, still watching. He could feel it, a deep, unshakable certainty that the woods were more than they seemed, that their true nature could never be fully banished or understood. The whispers were gone, but they had left an indelible mark, a sense that the forest was not yet finished with him. As John walked away, the events of the night played over in his mind. The glowing orb, the shadows that had come to life, the final confrontation with the entity. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, something he had missed, a piece of the puzzle that remained just out of reach. The forest had taken something from him, pieces of his past, memories of his grandfather, moments that he could no longer recall. They were lost to him, yet he felt their absence acutely, like a hollow ache in his chest. And with that emptiness came a question, one that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Had he truly escaped, or was he still bound to the forest in some way, its influence lingering even now? The road back to town was long, and John moved slowly, his thoughts clouded, his senses dulled by exhaustion. He passed the old highway, the abandoned landmarks that once felt familiar, now tinged with an eerie sense of disquiet. It was as if the forest had reached out, its influence stretching beyond its borders, tainting the world around him. He could still hear faint echoes of the whispers, could still see shadows shifting at the edges of his vision, and he couldn't be sure if they were real or merely remnants of his fractured mind. The line between reality and the supernatural had blurred, and he wasn't certain if it would ever be clear again. When John finally reached his home, the sun had risen, bathing the town in a golden light that should have brought comfort. But as he stood at his front door, key in hand, a chill ran down his spine. The house felt different, foreign, as though it no longer belonged to him. He hesitated, the key trembling in his grasp, a sudden, inexplicable fear taking hold. He opened the door slowly, stepping inside, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, searching for anything out of place. Everything was as he had left it, yet it felt wrong, an atmosphere of unease that seemed to hang in the air, a feeling that he was not alone. He moved through the house, each room silent and still, but the sense of being watched persisted, an unseen presence lurking in the corners, just beyond his sight. He stopped in the living room, his eyes drawn to the old photograph on the mantel, a picture of him as a child, standing with his grandfather. The face of the old man was blurred, the features indistinct, as though the memory had been erased not just from his mind, but from reality itself. John's heart sank, the ache in his chest deepening, a reminder of what he had lost, of the price the forest had demanded. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the hallway, barely audible, but unmistakable. His blood ran cold, his body tensing, every muscle on edge. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to grow darker, deeper, as the whisper repeated, a single word that chilled him to the core. Return. The voice was familiar, achingly so, and John's heart pounded as he realized it was his grandfather's voice, distorted, distant, but undeniably his. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, to move, reaching out toward him, and John backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The realization hit him like a blow. He had not escaped. The forest had followed him, its darkness still reaching for him, still demanding something more. The entity had been defeated, but the forest was not finished with him. It had taken his memories, had taken pieces of his past, but it wanted more. The whispers grew louder, the shadows stretching across the floor, and John knew that the fight was far from over. The forest had let him leave, but it had not let him go. It was a part of him now, its presence embedded in his very soul, a darkness that would never fully release its hold. John turned away from the shadows, moving to the window, his eyes drawn back to the distant line of trees at the edge of town. They stood there, silent and still, but he could feel their gaze, could feel the pull of the forest, a lure that promised answers, that promised an end to the fear. He knew that one day he would have to return, that the forest would call him back, and that the mystery of what lay within would never truly be resolved. The darkness had claimed a part of him, And no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, the forest would always be there, waiting, watching, a silent promise of terror yet to come.